Well, the Johnson County War, which is one of the central stories of Wyoming's foundation, was a struggle over a protracted period of time that really came to a head in 1892 between large cattle interests that had come into the state a little earlier in the 1880s and small ranchers like the folks who would have lived in a house like this. And the reason the struggle came about is that all ranching in Wyoming at that time, at least all ranching in central and northern Wyoming, was conducted with a large amount of the federal public domain as the grazing land that was used for it. So what it really amounted to was a struggle over who controlled grazing rights on the federal domain. Almost all ranching in Wyoming, with the exception of some in the southern part of the state, comes about due to the Homestead Act, the original Homestead Act that was passed actually during the Civil War. The practice became early with the large interest to divide the land that they were grazing into grazing districts. And ultimately they formed the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which is still in existence. It's a very long-running Wyoming entity that controlled the roundups in the grazing districts, not only in Wyoming, but actually into southern Montana and part of North Dakota. Those large entities, in part because they were first and in part because of the way they were established, came to see the grazing lands that they controlled from their headquarters as really being theirs. But the fact of the matter is that even though they controlled the federal domain, and over half of Wyoming remains federal domain, they didn't own it. And so as more homesteaders came in, and actually as their own cowboys began to acquire livestock, some cowboys took part of their pay in livestock, they'd begin to file these smaller homesteads within the grazing lands controlled by the larger ones. And that ultimately led to a competition between the two groups for space. Cattle ranching in central Wyoming provided really the only economic activity of any kind well into the late 1890s. A town like Casper was really a railhead in ranching country. Cattle was everything in the economy at that time. Cattle rustling is the theft of cattle. And in an area like this, the way that was policed was actually largely private. Branding, the registration of brands in Wyoming actually came in through the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. So you recorded your brand with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The Stock Growers Association had detectives that it hired to help police the theft of cattle to try and prevent it. The theft of cattle is, simply larceny. And so theoretically what happened in cattle theft is that the perpetrators were arrested, taken to the county courthouse, and given a speedy trial. As a practical matter, the distances involved often just ended in death. I mean, if a person was found rustling cattle and caught, they could expect not to be coming back in. It sounds barbaric, but if you look around this territory and realize how far out you are at any one time, bringing a person in is not a very easy thing to do, and people often just didn't do it. There'd been a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the big interest in central Wyoming in 1890 through 1892. That began the process of some assassinations in the southern Johnson County area, where someone was taking the law into their own hands, and there's a lot of talk about who was responsible for that and who was a witness to it. In the winter of 1891 and 1892, interest from the neighboring county, Converse County, began to propose a solution, what they viewed as a final solution to this, and that met with the support of the larger interest in the Stock Growers Association. Much of the planning for the invasion took place in the Cheyenne Club, which was a club that large cattle interest frequented in Cheyenne. So they met and decided that what they would do is they would fund and provide a force for an invasion of this county, Natrona County. Johnson County and Converse County. And then they went about doing that by providing for arms and ammunition that were brought into Cheyenne, providing for horses through Western Union, and then they went down to Texas and recruited a party of men to come up and act as the invading army. Now, those men were recruited, of course, for their skills, not in negotiation, but in other things, and they were given a cover. They were actually told that they were being hired to go in and arrest and deal with rustlers, and that they would have warrants to serve. And so what they did is they actually hired a chartered train, brought the men up through Denver from Texas into Cheyenne and then into Casper in early April 1890 and disembarked them at night. The news ceased to be a secret almost immediately, and the Cheyenne newspapers, which were sympathetic to large cattle interest, began to report on it almost immediately, and in fact, the men had hardly gotten off the train before the news hit. So that began to form the initial thought that there's an invading force in the county and they're going to do something. And they were right. The invading force had a list of 70 men who were to be addressed by the party, and so 70 men were expected to lose their lives in the operation if it was fully successful. One individual who would have undoubtedly had known that he would have been the subject of an expedition like this was Nate Champion, who in fact did lose his life in the invasion. The Casey Ranch was a ranch that's in southern Johnson County. It's still there. And that was the location that Nate Champion and some of his fellows were at as this expedition moved up from Casper on their trip north. And they were, in fact, attacked in the early morning hours in an event that resulted in a full day's time being lost while the expedition attempted to get principally Champion, and they did in the end. The fact that the invaders stopped at the KC did a couple things. One thing is it took a mounted expedition that was already desperately behind in schedule and delayed it even further. It took them an entire day to deal with basically 2 men holed up in a cabin, which was a pretty extraordinary delay. On top of it, it began to sow some dissension in the ranks because it did suggest to men who came up from Texas that not everything was completely on the up and up with what they were doing. Faced with delays, faced with a problem that they now had a pretty fatigued set of horses and whatnot, went from there to the TA ranch. And when they were at the TA ranch, they stopped there in order to try and get a little rest and reprovision. They were then met by a large party of individuals who came down from Buffalo. And basically what Buffalo had done is, Johnson County had done, is formed a posse to react to what was going on, and they put them under siege. Prior to the invasion, Governor Barber, who had also been informed of the invasion and basically was in on the plans, had issued an order to the county sheriffs that the Wyoming State Militia could only be called out by the governor. He sent a telegraph himself, but that telegraph was to President Benjamin Harrison, and it just said that a state of insurrection existed in Johnson County. He didn't explain how the insurrection had come about and who was in on the insurrection, but he asked for the Army to be deployed from Fort D.A. McKinney, which is outside of Buffalo and Sheridan, because he was worried at that point that this was going to become not only a colossal scandal, there's almost no hope at that point that it wasn't going to become a colossal scandal, but that what was going to occur is that the law enforcement authorities in Johnson County were actually going to override and storm these forces and probably kill them. That really wasn't the expressed intent of the individuals in Johnson County. But I mean, it wasn't an unrealistic fear that a lot of these guys who he knew, who were his political allies, quite a few of whom had been signatories to the Constitution of the state, which was only a couple years old, were going to die as a result of this event. So he was at that point willing to do whatever was necessary to get some intervention in it and to keep it from getting any worse than it already was. Politically, what happened is there was a brief period of time in Wyoming when the political fortunes of various parties really were impacted by the cattle war. Wyoming, in this period of time, was really a Republican state. All of the political leadership of the period we're talking about was really principally Republican. After the cattle war, the Republican Party suffered pretty significantly at first because they were so heavily implicated in what had occurred. It did result in Barber's political downfall. He didn't survive the next election. Governor Osborne, a Democrat, came in. Barber actually refused to surrender office in an event that's almost surreal. Osborne had to enter basically through the window because Barber wouldn't leave. So we had a real peculiar period of time where this occurred. And over a period of about a year, this was a huge political issue. It impacted the legislature and everything else. And at the end of the year, those who were arrested and who thought they were going to stand trial really did not. There was a lot of early courtroom maneuvering. And under Wyoming's law at the time, the county had to pay to house prisoners, even if they were outside of the county. Johnson County just couldn't afford it. And at the end of the year or so, they were let go. The net impact of the cattle wars is interesting in that when you look at it, it would have appeared that the small cattlemen prevailed. I mean, they did defend themselves. And then it would have appeared that the large cattlemen weathered the storm. But what it did do is it taught them that opposing the small homestead entrance, or at least the small cattle entrance, was a lost cause. There was actually more 20th century homesteading in Wyoming than there was 19th century. So homesteading continued to go on, but the big cattle operations didn't cease to exist. They did become much smaller. They inevitably had to, just because of that. They'd been enormous at one time, but they continued to exist. And a few of the ranches that were involved in this story actually still exist and still are around, so they survived all that time.